the Green Movement protests were like the first protests that I attended. And I saw like this transition from young people having so much hope, just being on the streets 24/7. And then immediately after the election, I saw how angry they were, and then how they kind of started losing hope. So I saw this like cycle of having hope, losing hope, but you still have to fight.
You're listening to Calling Others. Calling Others is a podcast miniseries featuring the stories of young Swana-American creatives and advocates. This podcast is a little reminder. Our personal stories matter. They have more power over politics than we realize. I'm your host, Nastar Anfar, and this episode's guest is Bahar Ghandehari. Bahar is a current university student and a founding member of Middle East Matters, a digital organizing platform focused on uplifting regional news with a social justice edge. In this episode, we talk through the power of social media, citizen journalism, diasporic/regional solidarity, and more. Here's our conversation in today's episode.
For years until college, I disconnected from my identity because I just wanted to fit in as an Iranian immigrant, not familiar with the generation here, with the culture here. So I totally put my identity as an Iranian in a box, and I did not look at it until I was in college. And that's when I felt more comfortable exploring my Middle Eastern identity, because I was surrounded with other Middle Eastern people. And in 2019, I got involved in advocacy through my Palestinian friends. Later that year, there were also protests happening in the Middle East and in my home country, Iran, that we now call it the Bloody November protests, because hundreds, if not thousands, were killed and arrested. At the same time, there were protests happening in Iraq that turned out to be extremely bloody as well. A lot of activists were later killed. And then there were also protests happening in Lebanon for economic reasons and for anti-corruption protests. And I couldn't find the right groups to organize with, because they were also scattered, both within the Iranian community and also the Middle Eastern community in general. So I attended like different events, one for Iran, one for Lebanon, one for Iraq, and I was just so confused that why are we not organizing together? We're basically protesting at the same time for the same things, especially like in the diaspora community, since we're all together. That was when I had like the idea of starting something myself, where I could promote this sort of unified solidarity within the Middle Eastern community, and where I could also get more Middle Eastern youth involved and active in the advocacy work, and where I could also promote our message in English for my non-Middle Eastern friends. Because during that time, besides the fact that I was really frustrated with our lack of unification and solidarity, I was also frustrated with my non-Middle Eastern friends, because they didn't know what was happening. The English media like covered the protest for maybe a week, and then they forgot about it, as they always do. I was attending university, and nobody knew that in the background I was also dealing with my family being in Iran, my friends dealing with their communities in Lebanon and Iraq. So that was also frustrating, and I think that was also one of the main reasons that I started Middle East Matters.
So what exactly does Middle East Matters accomplish, and how does it do that?
So Middle East Matters is basically a youth-run organization, and we focus a lot on digital campaigning and advocacy work. We campaign around different issues, especially like issues related to women's rights. One of our campaigns has been on femicides and or honor killings, and we have campaigned for protesters who were going to be executed. We've campaigned for people, dual citizens who've been held in Iran or other countries. And so we try to push our narrative through this digital slash like media campaigning sort of model. And I feel like the reason that we have focused a lot on digital advocacy is because it is sometimes the only way to connect the two worlds, and it is sometimes the only way to get information out rapidly as events are unfolding in the Middle East. So, like during Afghanistan or during the conflict in Palestine last year, we were on top of just reporting about what's happening there, because when you stop reporting on the issues and on the events unfolding, that's when everything gets more violent. Especially when governments use the internet as a tactic to crush protests. So we try to fill in those holes when that happens by looking at non-English media like Farsi, Arabic, and trying to get the information that's not being reported in English media out to the world. And also, since we're like our team is extremely Middle Eastern, we try to also put our personal stories and personal connections out there, because it is really important to get people to see like the humanity behind everything. And they may not feel as close as I do to, for example, Iran or to the Middle East in general, but they may be able to see my pain for my family going through it, my friends going through it, and they may connect through that.
Can you give it like a specific example of a time when personal storytelling played a really important role in your advocacy and organizing work?
I think one campaign that I really had to put my Iranian identity out there for was the campaign for the 3 protesters being executed, about to be executed in Iran. And I think it was 2019 or 2020, I think. And that's when I decided that I need to put my identity as an Iranian out there for people to see what we are going through as a group of people. So I try to connect with my non-Iranian friends through that identity, and show them that, like, if you care about me as a person, then you see how this issue is painful for me, and why it matters to me.
I think you talked earlier about the ways in which Middle East Matters is like media centered. It's a digital campaign for the most part, and that's like part of the way that you connect two worlds that are often disconnected. I would love to hear your thoughts about how citizen journalism plays into your work. What do you see as the power of citizen journalism at this point in time, and to your work specifically?
If you look at some of the issues that we are fighting for, whether it's the situation of detainees or whether it's the situation of women's rights, those are the stuff that are not being reported on, because the media in Iran and journalists in Iran can't report on it. So we get a lot of the information that we need for our campaigns through people there, through citizens there. So citizen journalism, whether it's for protests happening in Iran and Iraq, in Lebanon and Syria, or whether it's for the situation of detainees right now, is extremely important. I mean, the whole Arab Spring started with social media, basically. It was a social media movement. And that's where citizen journalism and social media movements really became a key part of advocacy and human rights work in the Middle East. So I think since then, most organizers and activists have been really using that tool for their causes, and that's basically just because we don't have freedom of press. We don't know where to get information from. We can't get it from journalists. We can't get it from the government. So we have to get it from the people. And but that doesn't mean the information is not going to be source checked and double checked. It just means that it's going to be a little harder to get information out there.
What do you see as the power in digital organizing?
It's quick, and you can reach a lot of people through it, because everybody's on social media now. Everybody has an iPhone or a laptop, so you can connect with a lot of people. And for when it comes to human rights and when it comes to minority issues, especially in the Middle East, it's sometimes hard to get people interested and reach people. So you have this amazing tool called social media, where you can just put out there a lot of information, a lot of infographics, a lot of video, a lot of audio, and one of those mediums is going to click with someone, and it's going to get someone interested. You have the issue of misinformation and disinformation, and so it is really important to know where you're getting your information from, to not always trust what you're receiving. We saw that during Ukraine, where videos from Palestine were being circulated, showcasing it as Ukraine. We also saw that in Syria.
I think it requires a certain level of like digital intelligence that we've all collectively had to develop. I think you make a great point about like social media being powerful for connecting spaces. I think a lot of people like look down on social media or think that it's like, I mean, I'm sure you've heard the term like slacktivism. And in a lot of cases, like that is the reality. But I think in an information sharing way, I totally see how that is like really powerful and like unmatched in other networks when you're trying to do this multi-country, inter-country work.
One thing that I personally get sometimes very frustrated with is for the campaigns and for the advocacy work, sometimes you gotta just hop on trends. And as much as I hate it, because this is an important work and you don't want it to be a trend, sometimes you just have to accept that a lot of the work you do is going to be a trend for maybe like a month or two, and then after that people are going to forget. So now you have to think of new ways to make it a trend again. So activism has sort of become this new trend among our generation, and especially social media activism.
Do you see anything changing in the future of digital organizing? Do you think that there is something you would like to see changed?
Right now, digital organizing is probably more trending and more accessible to the Western communities. And I really hope we can work towards having these spaces more accessible to the communities that may not have access to technology or to internet, to the online world, basically.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about you. I know you'd mentioned, I mean, you're Iranian-American, you were born in Iran. I was born in Iran. I was born in Kashan.
Oh, amazing. I was born in Isfahan.
So I would love to hear about what your advocacy work tells us about you and your cultural history.
I usually never talk about my stories and my personal connections to the Middle East and to Iran. I usually try to just amplify other stories. So this will probably be like the first time that I talk about myself. I grew up in a very, very open-minded family, and I'm really thankful for that, because it shaped who I am right now, and why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I was surrounded with like powerful women in the family, but that affected like how I perceive women's rights issues. But sometimes I tell my friends that being Middle Eastern is both a curse and a blessing. It is a curse because it comes with a lot of heartache, especially right now with the global politics that we have. It gets pretty painful sometimes. But at the same time, it's a blessing because there is so much history and so much culture behind my identity, and that I'm extremely proud of. But at the same time, being born and raised in Iran has impacts every decision that I make unconsciously. I don't even have to think about my identity, but whenever I come across opportunities, or whenever I sit down and talk with someone or have a conversation, somehow I always circle back to the Middle East and the issues there, because I feel like it is my duty to just talk about it as much as I can, so that people can get to know the Middle East.
I would love to hear about like moments that you personally felt like, this is the kind of work I want to do. Were there conversations you had with people in your life or family members that led you to where you're at?
I think one moment that may be a common moment for a lot of Iranians. It was the 2009 Green Movement in Iran. So I was there at the moment. I was still living in Iran. The Green Movement protests were like the first protest that I attended. It was pretty amazing because I saw like this transition from young people having so much hope, just being on the streets 24/7. And then immediately after the election, I saw how angry they were, and then how they kind of started losing hope. So I saw this like cycle of having hope, losing hope, and but you still have to fight. And I think that affected me a lot. Neda Sultan was an Iranian woman who was shot during one of those protests, and I was 9 at the time, but the images of her bloody face, like still lives in my mind. And I remember after I left Iran, one of the first projects that I did in middle school was on Nida Sultan, and it just brings tears into my eyes. And I feel like that was like one of the moments in my life where I decided that this was wrong. Like I was 9 years old. I didn't know the politics back then. I wasn't really involved, but I knew that this is not right. This cannot be right. And I remember during the protests, for some reason, my mom and I decided that we needed to go shopping back then during that time. I don't know why, but I needed shoes. And I remember when we were at the mall, the protests got violent outside of the mall, and the guards started shooting, and so we couldn't leave the mall. So we had to stay at the shoes store for like a couple of hours until everything was calmed down. And I don't know, I find it really funny now. It probably isn't funny, but I don't know why I needed shoes at that time, but yeah.
I surprisingly was also there during that time, but I was visiting family. So I remember just like there being a lot of traffic and just being super confused. And everyone in my family was like tense. And I was like, I don't know what's happening. But I was similarly, I was probably like 10 or 11.
For a lot of, for example, Syrians, the kids that are 11 years old right now, they have not seen anything else other than war and conflict and violence. So it breaks my heart that like I was privileged that Iran wasn't really involved in a war or conflict during my time there. There were a lot of protests happening, but I never experienced what Syrians are experiencing right now.
I think, yeah, it's good to even recognize like our inter-community privilege in some ways, like even though like this, because I think like people in the US like aren't able to like comprehend the like differences between countries and situations and standings, and I think it's important as community members to do that. Speaking of, have you ever faced any inter-community challenges when doing your work, or inter-community challenges as well?
I would say most of the challenges come from generational um, differences. And it's also amazing to know that it's not just like in my community, like the Iranian community, we cannot agree on one thing. It's also like the Syrian community, like other Middle Eastern community. I was attending like different events for different Middle Eastern communities, and I was like, we're pretty similar, like, and it's and I feel like it comes from there are different generations fighting for the same thing, and different generations probably experience different things. My grandparents experienced like the Iran-Iraq war that I didn't experience, and then my mom experienced different things, and I experienced different things. So it's sometimes that makes it really hard to agree on one path towards our goals, towards like democracy and freedom and rights. Uh, but at the end of the day, it is so important to remember that we're all basically fighting for the same thing. Like, it doesn't matter if I disagree with you on the way you're going about it. It matters if you respect my way and I respect your way.
How do you feel about having gone into this space as an Iranian-American? How do you feel like that identity has been politicized, if at all?
Being Iranian-American is definitely hard because of the way that Iran is right now portrayed, and because of the horrible stuff that the Iranian government is doing. So it is really important for me to show that Iranians, me as an Iranian, can stand in solidarity with you as a Syrian, as an Iraqi, as a Lebanese, even though my government is probably doing horrible things to your countries. I, as an Iranian, as an individual, I am different from my government.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think distinguishing between the government and its people is something a lot of people have a hard time doing, and it results in a lot of very problematic discourse. In terms of specifics, I would love to hear about whether you've had moments when you felt like your American identity and like being someone who like currently lives in the West has impacted your ability or inability to understand situations happening on the ground in the Middle East. Personally, I mean, I immigrated later or earlier than you did, and so like I've had like a lot more of my identity be morphed by two spaces, and I've had moments where I have had a take or an opinion and I've had to double check where exactly that information is coming from. Being someone who's working in media and digital organizing, most of what you do is share and understand information. How do you feel like the American part of your identity and the Iranian part of your identity balance or mix or affect each other when you're processing or creating that information or those narratives?
When I went to Iran this summer, I realized that, wow, I am Iranian, but at the same time, I am American with so many privileges. I was there during the COVID crisis, like the pandemic was at its height. And I realized, wow, I'm the only person in my family right now who's vaccinated. I left Iran right before the protest for the water crisis started. So I had this like passport privilege and this American identity privilege, and I was like, this needs to be balanced out, and the only way I can do that is by connecting with the people on the ground and making sure they are involved in the work. I've always wanted to have this community of Middle Eastern activists connected together. So I've been trying to reach out to different activists and different organizations on the ground and just working with them. So we actually recently worked with two organizations in Afghanistan, and Pashtana Durrani, who is an amazing organizer and advocate for education in Afghanistan. She's lived in Afghanistan. She's been working in Afghanistan. She recently came out because of the political crisis right now, and so she's been an amazing connection that I recently developed with Afghanistan. So I've been trying to do that with other countries, just reaching out to organizers, seeing how I can help them, because all I want to do is amplify their work because they're doing most of the job.
Being a social media platform that engages with both audiences in the Middle East and in the West, how do you prevent yourself from falling into harmful stereotypes about the Middle East? I have a specific example. So there's this beautiful book. It's by her name is Rafia Zakaria. I really, really recommend it. It's called Against White Feminism. She's Pakistani, and she lives in the US. And she talks about this portrayal or like understanding of honor killings. And she talks about the ways in which, like, when audiences in the West engage with that idea, they automatically disconnect it from the idea of domestic violence, and they do so to uplift the idea of like the white Western modernized form of violence, as opposed to like a backwards uncivilized violence when it comes from other spaces. So that's an example of like that, like the differences in how narratives are received. I'd love to hear if that has ever affected your campaigns or the way you've portrayed certain things or your understanding of them, because you're interacting with two different audiences and you're right at the middle of both of them.
When we first started talking about honor killings on Middle East Matters, we received a lot of backlash both from the Middle Eastern community and the Western community. The Middle Eastern community was angry because we were reporting on honor killings a lot, and they thought that that's gonna leave a negative mark on our identity as Middle Easterners. And the Western audience was angry because they thought this is something that's going on, that's part of our culture, and we have to, and there is nothing we can really do about it. So they were demonizing the culture and the identities, and so we decided that from now on, whenever we report on honor killings, we have to make sure to also report on the fact that these honor killings are not part of the culture. These honor killings are probably happening because a lot of the laws that are in these countries are protecting the perpetrators, that women's rights are not being protected, and that if they were being protected, these perpetrators would probably not do these crimes as much, as often as they do right now. So we also have to talk about, besides the politics, besides the culture, we also have to talk about the lack of legislation and the lack of protection for women. We decided to not call it honor killings anymore and push the word femicide out there more, so that they understand that, like, we don't agree with honor killing. Like, we're not saying these are honor killing, because there is absolutely no honor in killing. So let's call it what it is. These are like femicides, anti-women crime.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for explaining that. That was very interesting, and it's such a hard thing, I think, to balance. So I think it's really cool that you're trying to navigate that. Is there anything you would recommend when trying to pursue this type of work? Is there anything you would stray away from?
Be a very good listener, because you cannot organize and advocate for people, especially multiple communities, if you don't listen to those communities. So and sometimes we unfortunately forget that in our own communities too, to listen to each other before acting, before judging, before disagreeing. Then just fight for whatever you believe, even if you receive backlash. Because a lot of the times what we fight for could be controversial, it could be unpopular, and a lot of times it may not receive the responses that you're looking for, and it may not get as much attention that it needs, and that could be tiring. Like, they can be tiring. So
going off of that, do you think that there's anything specific that's missing from the organizing and activism space right now?
we don't really listen to young people. And that's why I want Middle East Matters to be youth run, because the future of the Middle East is basically the young people. And if we don't listen to them, if we don't appreciate their ideas, the way they fight for those ideas, and the unique perspectives that young people bring to the table, then we're in a lot of trouble.
That's how the world continues to churn out the same situations, and it is when like people aren't allowed access. That's part of the reason I'm doing this podcast. Another question about your work specifically: how can those listening support you and your work? Are there any current campaigns, upcoming campaigns, or any upcoming events?
If anyone's interested, after listening to this podcast, to this episode, we're always trying to expand the team, more people, more ideas, and upcoming events, upcoming campaigns. We are trying to organize a fundraiser for Syria, as we are entering the 12th year of the conflict, of the revolution. So that's coming up. If you want to look out for that.
Cool. Thank you so much, Bahar.
Thank you so much for having me on this podcast.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can continue supporting Bahar's work on Instagram at Middle East Matters. Thank you for listening. You can find Calling Others on major podcast platforms or on Win Without War's website. The music found in this episode is from Storyblocks, and this episode was produced and edited by me, Nasta Anfar, and Natalie Bettendorf. See you next time.